Hey y'all, it's April Bowden here with TRUTHERTALK. Since I started doing these videos about narcissism, I have been really encouraging the audience to give me their feedback and give me questions. And if somebody gives an interesting comment or question, I will make a video about it. So this one's for Kate. And Kate, thank you for your donation. Kate asked a question about my personal experience and what got me to want to start writing about narcissism, and she tagged onto that, that something I said in one of the videos about how I did think that people in higher power, or the elite, whatever you want to call them, are actually narcissists and sociopaths. And I'll get to that later. I wrote an article called "The Vaccine Industry is a Malignant Narcissist," and I'll put that in the description. But basically, yeah, people in Washington and Hollywood, there's a lot of narcissism and sociopathy just running rampant. And the organizations as a whole act in a very Machiavellian manner, which is, the ends justify the means, which is a particularly narcissistic behavior. So there's definitely a large element of that going on. However, those are two separate questions, because the first one is, why did I decide to start doing these videos? What was my interest, and why did I start researching this a few years ago in the first place? And so I'm going to start with that, answering that question, because I actually wanted to do a video entitled "Narcissists and Empaths in the Truth Movement" from the beginning. That's one of the things that I've had on my mind that I wanted to talk about. And so that actually is a good way to segue into this. Her question is a good way to segue into this video that I've been meaning to do anyway. So how did I get into it? Well, several years ago, when Verstine and I first started the podcast, we had taken the red pill. We had decided, that we were living in a matrix. We started to see lies and hypocrisies in the world around us, and so much of what we had been told was untrue, or what we had been brought up to believe was fallacious. And as we began to research more and more and more, it was just shocking. And out sprouted this podcast that we decided to start running. First I started blogging and writing, and then came the podcast. So in the process of running the podcast, we ended up meeting a lot of other people in the truth movement. We ended up interacting with other people in alternative media who were also running podcasts, or who were, blogging and researching and doing the same things that we were doing. And when I came into that, I approached it in a very subjective way, because I assumed that anybody who was in the truth movement and in the alternative media was likely to be empathic, even though I didn't have necessarily words to describe what an empath was at the time, because I hadn't really looked into any of that stuff yet. I knew from my own personal experience that the thing that made me want to be a part of it was, once I recognized all this injustice in the world, I started to empathize with the victims. I started to empathize with the vaccine injured. I had a vaccine injured child, so I obviously empathized with him. But not just him, many other families have children who were victimized, and children who were killed by vaccines. And I started to identify with other things as well. These illegal wars that we were involved in, and the people that were being destroyed over these lies about terrorist attacks, and so on and so forth. All this stuff really affected me and Verstine, and it triggered our empathic nature to then empathize with the victims. And so I could really see and feel what was happening to some of these people in a very profound way. And empaths often have the tendency to do this even at their detriment of recognizing their own feelings and their own self. So while I was very empathetic to victims and other people, I didn't really recognize myself as a victim. And the fact that we had been victimized by narcissistic abuse, because the vaccine industry, being a malignant narcissist and acting in a Machiavellian manner, had destroyed my son's health. And I had to watch that before my very eyes, and it was painful experience. But it wasn't, but for me, as an empath, I had a hard time identifying with that as though I was victimized and I blamed myself. And I did that for many years. I introspected on it and saw what part of that was, what part I did contribute to that. But empaths are very easily able to blame themselves. We're very easily able to take our accountability and our responsibility to a fault. We take it way past the level that we deserve, and then often don't recognize where we ourselves have been victimized. And this is one of the things that makes us so vulnerable and so ripe for narcissistic abuse. There's a few things, but that's one of them. So when I came into the movement, I just assumed that everybody kind of had a similar experience, because most people that we interacted with had some profound moment in their lives that got them to start seeking deeper truths and start making them go down the rabbit hole. And for us, it was the health movement. It was the natural health that we wanted to explore to help correct our own issues, Verstine and I. And so that's what got us to look at the medical industrial complex and so forth, and then we could see other entrails and other roads leading back to this thing, the Matrix or the New World Order, or whatever you want to call it. And so that's where we came from. And so when I was very naive when we first started the show, assuming that other people had that same experience. And so when we started interacting with some of the other people in the truth movement, I realized that they didn't all have that empathic nature. Some of them had very bizarre behaviors that I didn't quite understand. And I was speaking to, a few years ago, I was speaking to my very good friend, Liam Sheff. I talk about him a lot. And he was one of my best friends, and he was also in the truth movement and alternative media. He passed away last April. And because he was one of my best friends, I confided to him in a lot of things. And I was telling him about this person that I was dealing with through the podcast, somebody that I had to interact with. And he said to me, you need to research borderline personality disorder and narcissism, because what you're dealing with is something like that. And I was like, what? That's weird. And I'd not heard of a borderline before. I'd heard of a narcissist and a sociopath, but I didn't really know that a narcissist was a full-blown pathology. I thought it was just a selfish, arrogant person. I didn't really recognize that it was something that was pathological. And to be honest, my attitude about psychology was very agnostic. I thought, well, this is interesting, but I don't really put a lot of, credibility into it. I don't, because I just assumed that everybody who had some kind of pathology was probably a wounded person, and they would probably have been hurt at some point in their life. So I took this kind of agnostic, moral relative attitude about it, and didn't really know who was good or who was bad. It wasn't very clear to me, right? So then once I started researching the borderline personality and the narcissism, being that I'm a nerd, right? So once my light bulb goes off, I go way down the rabbit hole, like deep, way past the point that most people do. And, a lot of people might find that annoying, but I can't help myself. My dad by trade is a private investigator, so maybe I get it from him. But whatever the case may be, I have this nerd mentality that I really like to understand things to the fullest extent possible. And so when I started researching it, and it fascinated me, I realized that I had been interacting with cluster B personalities my entire life. I could see, friendships and past relationships and, family members and all kinds of people that were on the cluster B spectrum. They were either narcissists or borderlines or sociopaths or any combination of the three, right? And because in my assumption that narcissists were just selfish, arrogant people, and that sociopaths were serial killers, I didn't realize that there was anything else to it, right? And so once I started looking into it and I started seeing it, being a good truther, I tried to find another angle. I tried to find an angle that looked at it as, maybe it's not so black and white. Maybe these people aren't just pathological and bad and evil. So I really wanted to believe that it was possible to turn it around for these people and that there was some kind of difference. But the more that I researched it, and the more that I found interactions with these kind of characters, I didn't really think that that was the case anymore. I didn't really know if that was possible, because they lived in such a world of delusion, for one, and they also live in a place called Opposite Land, where they make people crazy by accusing everybody around them of doing the things that they are actually doing to everybody else. So, in other words, they always paint themselves as a victim, and that everybody else is the one that's hurting them, even though they're the ones that are wreaking havoc, right? So, bringing in this back to the truth movement. So a lot of truthers, a lot of people running podcasts and blogs and having followings and popular followings fit the profile of full pathological narcissist. Okay? And I started to see this in a, when I pulled back and I started to look at this in a bigger perspective, I said, well, how is that possible? Because as an empath, it seemed that you would come into this from a place of wanting to help others and identifying with the victims and wanting to, fix the ills of the world. So how does a narcissist do that? And then there also seems to be a certain level of confidence or in your own beliefs as yourself, because how can, narcissists are not very self-aware people, so they don't really like to admit when they're wrong. So when you become a truther, you kind of have to go down this road of like, wow, everything I learned before was wrong, and everything I thought I believed before was wrong, right? So it's like, how do they get there when they're so committed to just being right all the time? But as I started to see this, and as I had interactions with a couple of them, I realized that they do like to be right all the time, and they don't like to be wrong. However, they do like to be the victim. And so what the empaths and the narcissists have in common, aside from there's a trauma bond, so there is a mutual experience that narcissists and empaths seem to have, which is some early developmental trauma. This is what causes the imbalance. Though being an empath or being overly empathetic is not a pathology. There's a lot of really good things to come out of it, but there is this imbalance that allows you to be vulnerable. There's the porous boundaries and not really recognizing toxic people as quickly as others, because you want to give everybody the benefit of the doubt. And empaths try not to be judgmental, and it's not good to prejudge, but it's okay to judge, right? Once you've experienced somebody and you've had them in your presence for a while and you start to realize that there's something wrong with them, it's okay to judge that, but empaths have a hard time with that. And that non-judgmental attitude is one of the things that when a truther comes up and says, hey, 9/11 is an inside job, an empath is not going to go, oh, fuck you, just get the hell away from me. They're going to go, oh, why would you say that? Because there's this non-judgmental attitude. There's this desire not to prejudge. So it makes us very open to researching things and trying to figure things out on our own. And then once we get there and we see all the people that have been victimized, we empathize with them very easily without even trying. So empaths, you can see clearly, would be people that would be attracted to alternative media and the truth movement because they're so invested in justice. But then I found that so are narcissists. Shocker, right? Narcissists are actually just as invested in justice, because while empaths have a hard time painting themselves as victims, they often take on responsibilities of things that happen to them, their own abuses, as if it was their fault. Narcissists blame everything else on the world, okay? So they're always the victim in their minds. No matter how much they victimize other people, they're always the victim, okay? So a narcissist they're not wrong. They've been wronged, okay? A narcissist in the truth movement is not going to say, I was wrong. They're going to say, I was duped. I was victimized. I was mind controlled into believing something fallacious, and therefore I am the victim. And they're going to continue to play that victim role. And they are going to be seekers of justice, but not for the downtrodden and for the people of the world, but for themselves. And you have to understand too, these are very immature people. So a lot of the narcissistic truthers that are out there are they're spraying stuff all over their walls on Facebook and talking about this stuff that is meant to directly trigger certain people who they feel have wronged them. So if you have a fallout with a narcissist, then they're going to end up, you know, trying to, whatever it is you believe in, they're going to try to prove it wrong. Okay? So if you have some, you know, religious belief, or you believe in, you know, the New Age or whatever it is, the narcissistic truther is going to take that and try to shit on it publicly. You know, not calling you out directly necessarily, but they're going to just try to make sure that everybody knows that you're wrong and they're right. Even if it means that they have to say that they were once wrong. Because it's okay for them to be not wrong, but wronged. Right? So I realized that empaths and narcissists, they're extremely magnetic to one another because we are polar opposites. One has too much empathy, the other one has not enough. And one is extraordinarily judgmental, and the other is not judgmental enough. And they both experienced trauma at some point in their lives, which causes this trauma bond that neither is aware of because it's complex. And they're both preoccupied with justice. Right? So empaths seek justice for the victims, people that they perceive as victims, while narcissists perceive themselves as victims and want to right the wrongs that were done to them. So a lot of narcissism going on in the truth movement. And you want to look for people who aren't really introspecting, who aren't really looking at their own complacency and their own contribution to the problem. Okay? When people are out there pointing fingers, and they're not really introspecting at all, that's a red flag. Okay? There has to be some level of introspection. The only truth that you can absolutely know for certain is that. Okay? Now, I mean, okay, I'm not going to say it in a new agey kind of way that, you know, in a quantum physics kind of, you know, you can't absolutely know truth. Because you can, you know, I can know there's a tree behind me and there's cars and things like that. I don't mean like that, you know, these tangible things that we can identify with our senses. I'm talking about the intention of others. You know, you can't really truly know where people are coming from, but you can try to look within yourself and understand that, right? So without that, without these people looking at introspection, without them trying to ask these deeper questions, these philosophical questions, you know? Because narcissists aren't going to be prone to a lot of philosophical questions. They're really going to act like they know everything. They're going to have a little air of arrogance about themselves. And they're going to be very quick to anger when they're criticized. So, because they will take that as a rejection of themselves. Not of, you know, what their message, but of themselves. They will take it personal. So, just saying that, you know, be conscious of it, be aware of the fact that it is out there. If you're not aware of it already, because I certainly wasn't at a certain point in my life. Actually, I don't know if I ever would have had I not run the show. So it was something that I had to experience for myself and see for myself. And it's funny how these things kind of lead to one another, because once I started researching narcissism, and I was looking at some of the blogs and the vlogs that are written by lay people like myself and also other healthcare workers and psychologists and psychiatrists, most of them were victims of narcissistic abuse at some point in their lives. And then they begin, and many of them will then start to take other red pills and go down different rabbit holes as a result of the fact that they're starting to see more of how the world works through the eyes of the narcissist. But for me, it was the other way around. I actually took the red pill first, but I hadn't introspected enough to recognize that I had been a victim of narcissistic abuse in my own personal life. So anyway, just be safe out there. Keep that in mind. Thanks for your question, Kate. Until next time, peace, truth, and love.